Oscar Wilde said that consistency is the last refuge of the unimaginative. And, a lot of highly intelligent people can change their mind when presented with different information. I think about if, you know, we would have met up for lunch and you told me about mushrooms, and I would have just been so closed off because I didn't agree with it. I didn't know it, whatever it was. I was not open to hearing it. Where like, my life, I think about my life and where I would be and how much that changed my life because of that conversation where I was curious to what you had to say and was willing to, like, listen and to hear you, and I think, we need to make it more common to say things like, "Oh, I used to think," or, "Oh, well, that's a good point,"
Didn't
or
think about it that
yeah,
way.
or, "Oh, let me reconsider," or, I've changed my mind given different information, or I used to agree with something and now I don't, or vice versa. I wish that we could get to a place, and I hope we do, where that is more normalized. And I think a lot of people they double down on these points to protect their ego, but to me, that is a measure of unintelligence because you're protecting your ego and you're tying your identity to being right instead of just being curious and being willing to learn or being willing to be wrong. Albert Einstein also said, "The measure of intelligence is the ability to change."
This one I think is really hard for people because I don't think people understand how much they operate out of ego unconsciously. And this is something that you and we touched on this when we talked to Amanda last week. I think that something that you could ask yourself is, why do I want this to be true so bad? And
Mm,
if it turns out to be true, how would I feel? And this isn't to judge yourself or to criticize yourself or to beat yourself up, but to be aware of something that you might be attached to that goes much deeper than the surface. I had to sit with the fact that I was a villain in my own story, and that was an extremely uncomfortable truth, but I didn't wanna see that because I knew once I saw that, there was gonna be some judgment, there was gonna be some shame, there was gonna be some guilt, and that happens a lot in sobriety when you are faced with this truth that you have an issue. Nobody wants to see that. An addict doesn't wanna see that
yeah.
because if they sit with that, they have to face this truth that you weren't always the victim, and that sucks because it means you may have been the villain. And you might feel shame, you might feel guilt, and those are very uncomfortable feelings. You have to it's just a hard thing to sit with, and I think it's important that you ask yourself, "Why do I want this to be true so bad?"
Well, and I think it is a lot easier to project than to self-reflect. It is a much harder job. I would say it's more worth it to look at yourself, but it's a much harder job to look at yourself and take some self responsibility for your own suffering, or realize that maybe some of the things that you thought you knew you didn't, or what
You
you
have to
thought
admit
were
you were
true weren't.
wrong.
Yeah, or admitting you're wrong.
Our
Yeah.
ego is so, so strong. It does not want to admit fault, and it does not want to admit that it was ever wrong about anything. So I just think sometimes it's hard to like put our ego to the side and be like, hey, it's okay. You're allowed to change your mind. That's actually more admirable.
Yeah.
You're allowed to say you were wrong. That's more admirable.
Yeah, I've changed my mind.
Yeah.